I'm Kelly Cody, and welcome to week 4 of our 52-week baking challenge. This week we're going to be doing a basic quick bread. Quick bread is exactly what it sounds like. It is something that you can throw together quickly, and it doesn't require any of the yeast like we did in our second week, right? So we're going to be coming in today with just a handful of ingredients, and one of the reasons I like this one so much is that you really can flavor the quick bread any way you like it. So step 1 is to go ahead and get your ingredients out. 1 3/4 cup of unbleached flour, 1 1/2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1 egg beaten, 3/4 cup of milk, 2/3 cup of sugar, and 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter melted. Additionally, you're going to be putting in any of the ingredients that you might want for your flavorings. I'm today going to be using pecans and coconut because that's what I had left over. However, you can absolutely substitute literally anything else. Fresh blueberries, walnuts, dried cranberries. If you have a lemon that's just kind of sitting on the counter, go ahead and zest that up and make a lemon poppyseed bread. We're going to be making a loaf today, but you can also turn this into muffins. So same process, just using a muffin tin instead of a loaf. So step 1 was getting our ingredients out. Step 2, preheat the oven to 350 degrees. You just heard mine beep, so it's ready to go. And we're going to next go ahead and start mixing up our dry ingredients. So we're going to have a bowl, a sieve, and a spatula. So I've got my spatula, I've got my bowl, and the reason that we're using a sieve on this is because we're going to be using a lot of dry ingredients, and then when you mix in, because it's a quick bread, we're going to be mixing in our liquid ingredients, and we're not going to be stirring much at all. And so what we have here is, so we want to use a sieve though to make sure that we don't end up with any lumps. So there we go. And you can see that there's a few crumbles, so I'm just going to mix those in. I'm next going to put in my sugar and my baking soda, my baking powder, and my salt. Now, the baking soda and the baking powder is what actually makes this a quick bread. Before baking soda and baking powders came about, we had to use yeast, and those can take hours, if not days, to finalize. And so quick breads, when the baking soda and baking powder came into use, we finally had another way to leaven or rise up the bread. Baking soda was discovered in the late 1700s, but it was used more in alchemical and scientific research and not in baking. It wasn't until the mid 1800s when baking powder came around that cooks and chefs actually started using it. So here you can see I've got my bowl with my dry ingredients in it. I'm gonna put my used bowls to the side, keeping things clean and tidy. And then the next thing we're gonna do is make a well here in the middle, and we're gonna end up pouring in all of our wet ingredients. So one of the ingredients we have is 4 tablespoons of butter, melted. And so that's actually an important distinction in the recipe itself. If a recipe calls for 4 tablespoons of melted butter, that means that you actually will end up measuring the butter after it's melted. But when a recipe calls for 4 tablespoons of butter, melted, it means you do the 4 tablespoons first, and then you melt it, and whatever you get is what you get. All right, so I've got my eggs scrambled, I've got my milk, I've got my butter. I'm gonna pour everything into the middle of this well that I've created. So milk is in, butter is in, scrambled up egg is in. And the other dry ingredient that we added a little bit ago, that was the salt. The salt has absolutely nothing to do with the rising of the bread. It is exclusively and completely for taste. You'll actually see when you're dealing with yeasted breads, and they have salt for the flavor as well, or also to help preserve it, they'll make sure that you put the salt and the yeast on separate sides of the dough because salt can counteract yeast, but that's not the case here. All right, so the trick on this is to go quickly. Typically, you're gonna wanna stir for just about 10 seconds. It's really just until things are moistened. And that's because we're using full-on unbleached flour, which the more you stir it, the more the gluten builds up, right? And the gluten building up gives you a chewy, sometimes almost a rubbery texture in a bread. So I've got that close to being mixed up. So the next thing I'm gonna do is just toss in my flavoring ingredients. And like I said, I'm using pecans and coconut, again, just because that's what I had in the cupboard. I had some leftovers from some of my holiday baking. So just stirring it a handful of times until it's just mixed. And you can see this entire batter, and it is more like a batter, right, than a bread dough. You can see this really just took, what, a minute maybe to put together completely. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and pour this into my prepared tin loaf. Now this is an 8 by 5 by 3 loaf tin. And I'm gonna just scoop around, scrape the edges, and use my fork from the egg just to get that spatula nice and clean. Okay. And now I'm gonna just, probably should have done that next actually, because I'm pushing this to the edges. And you wanna make sure that your loaf tin is, again, I said an 8 by 5 by 3. If you use too small of a loaf tin, what'll happen is that as your bread is in the oven and it's rising up, it's gonna hit the top of it and it's gonna basically run out of room, and so it's gonna end up collapsing in on itself. So there we go. And now you can absolutely put this in the oven right now and cook it for an hour at 350 degrees. But what I'm gonna do, my favorite trick, is I'm just taking some regular sugar and I'm just gonna sprinkle this on the top. And what it does is that when the sugar gets into the oven, it actually kind of hardens, almost like the top of a creme brulee does. And it makes this just really nice kind of sweet crackle at the top that people seem to really, really like. It's just like butter. Sugar makes everything better, right? And that's it. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this in the oven, middle rack, and set it for an hour. Here we go, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, and we have an hour on the timer, and that's it. I will see you all back here in an hour. Okay, welcome back. My bread came out of the oven after just about 55 minutes. So the clue for me, I started to obviously smell it, right? That's always the first thing you'll do. So I turned on the oven light to look at it. The color was good. It was definitely getting brown. So I opened up the oven drawer to look and could see that the edge of the bread was actually just starting to come away from the inside of the pan. And then finally I stuck a toothpick in the middle of it and it came out clean. So that's how I knew that my bread was done before my full hour was up. So the next trick for you is when I took it out of the oven, I left it inside my baking loaf pan, right? So it's in here still. And I left it in there for about 10 minutes. And so what's happening is that the steam from the bread itself is actually going to make it even easier to take the bread out of the loaf. So I've got a cooling rack set out. It's been cooling inside of the pan, although it's still very quite hot. And I'm just gonna go ahead and, fingers crossed, just tip it out. And yep, it came right out exactly as I would hope. Okay, so I've got it upside down and it's probably, nope, it's not too hot to touch. So I'm just gonna use my hands, flip it over, and you can see there's that really, really nice crust on the top where we put in the sugar. So I can let it cool here on the rack, and really that's what I should do, is to let it cool. However, I'm gonna go ahead and cut into it right now just so we can see what it looks like on the inside. So let me grab a bread knife and we're gonna just cut off the edge of this crust. Oh, can you hear that? That sounds good, right? That crust on top. All right, and there we go. A nice, beautiful loaf. I can see that the pecans are spread throughout the whole loaf. So that means that I chopped them up well. If you chop them, if you don't chop them up enough, your nuts, they actually can sink to the bottom of your dough. So when you're making that. So yeah, everything in here looks fantastic. And let's see here, I'm just gonna get my butter out, because what's bread without butter, right? And just put on a little tiny bit of butter on top. And I love those flavors. That was wonderful. Still warm though. So again, as I was saying, feel free to make this bread with any flavors that you like. I did pecan coconut, but you can absolutely do banana nut, Jamaican banana nut, dried cranberries, fresh blueberries, lemon poppy seed, pistachios, whatever you have in your cupboard in terms of dried fruit, fresh fruit, nuts. Have fun with it and just kind of really make the bread your own. So I cannot wait to hear how your loaf comes out. Go ahead and leave me some comments below. or take a picture and show it to me. Other than that, I will see you next week. So this ends the first 4 weeks of our basic bakes. And so the next 4 weeks that we're going to be doing is all cookies, starting off with macarons. So come on back for week 5 of our first block of cookies for French macarons. I will see you then, and happy baking.